There is a small glass case on the upper floor of a museum in Munich. Inside it, a woman has been lying perfectly still for 3,000 years. She is not the largest exhibit. She is not the most golden. Tour groups drift past her on their way to the painted coffins and the temple fragments, and most people walk right past it. A linen-wrapped body, darkened by resin and time, the face long since hidden. A label, a catalog number, a name almost no one outside Egyptology has ever heard. Her name was Henut Taui, the Lady of the Two Lands. She lived around 1000 BC, a priestess who sang in the temple of Amun at Thebes, and she has spent the last century behind a pane of glass in Bavaria, donated to a king's collection and then forgotten. But hidden inside her is something that shouldn't exist. In 1992, a forensic scientist cut a few strands of hair from her preserved head and ran them through the same machines used to convict drug traffickers. The results came back, and then they came back again. And the laboratory in Germany went very quiet. Henut Taui's body contained cocaine and nicotine. Not a trace you could wave away, not a smudge on the surface. Measurable quantities locked inside the tissue of a woman who died more than 14 centuries before Christ. Here is the problem with that. Cocaine comes from one plant, the coca shrub, Erythroxylum coca. Nicotine, in the concentrations she carried, comes from another, tobacco nicotiana. And in 1000 BC, both of those plants grew in exactly one place on Earth, South America, a continent that, according to every history book ever printed, no Egyptian could possibly have reached. A continent separated from the Nile by an entire ocean that no one was supposed to be able to cross for another 2,500 years. So how did a South American drug end up inside an Egyptian priestess? That is the question that has haunted a small, stubborn corner of science for over 30 years. And the deeper you follow it, the stranger it gets. Let's start with what we actually know, because this is not a legend passed down by candlelight. This is a documented forensic case with names, dates, journals, and machines. The scientist was Dr. Svetla Balabanova, a respected German forensic toxicologist, a pioneer in detecting drugs in hair and tissue, the kind of expert whose testimony put real criminals in real prisons. In the early 1990s, she was asked to test a group of mummies held by the Egyptian Museum in Munich. Among them was Henut Taui. The mummies had a clean provenance. They had been acquired in the 19th century, brought to Bavaria under King Ludwig I, and had sat in the collection ever since. No modern excavation, no tabloid history, just old, quiet, well-documented Egyptian dead. Balabanova ran the standard battery, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, radioimmunoassay, the gold standard tests, the ones designed to be impossible to fool. She tested the hair. She tested deeper. Cocaine, nicotine, hashish. She did not believe it. No competent scientist would. So she sent the samples to 3 other independent laboratories without telling them what she expected to find. They all came back positive. In 1992, she published the result in the German scientific journal Naturwissenschaften. In a short, careful, almost nervous paper titled First Identification of Drugs in Egyptian Mummies, and the reaction from the world of Egyptology was not curiosity, it was fury. Because for decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic, the idea of contact between the old world and the new before Columbus, a romantic fantasy. The kind of thing that belonged in pulp novels, not peer-reviewed journals. Balabanova had just put hard chemistry behind the fantasy, and the establishment closed ranks. She was accused of contamination, of sloppy technique, of fraud. One reviewer reportedly told her the results were simply impossible, and, therefore, must be wrong. She spent years under that cloud. And if this were just one strange woman in one Munich case, the story might have ended there. It doesn't. There were others. Before I take you to the second body, I want to say one thing. If you find yourself leaning in right now, if you want to know how deep this actually goes, do me a favor and subscribe. This channel exists to chase exactly these threads, the ones the textbooks fold away, and hope you never pull. There are more of them than you think. Now, let's keep pulling. To understand why Balabanova's result was so dangerous, you have to understand how the Egyptians talked about the world beyond their own. They had a phrase, Ta Netjer, God's land, a distant, half-mythical place from which the most precious goods came. Incense, exotic woods, strange resins, things that did not grow along the Nile. For generations, Egyptologists treated God's land the way you'd treat any old religious phrase. Poetic, vague, a way of saying somewhere far away and holy. But what if it wasn't poetry? The Egyptians also wrote of voyages across what they called the Great Green Wajware, open water that their own carvings show them crossing in long ocean-capable ships. We know they reached the land of Punt, somewhere down the Red Sea or the Horn of Africa, and came back with cargo no one local could supply. We know they were not afraid of deep water. For a long time, the assumption was simple. They went a little way, they traded with neighbors, they came home. The grand language was just decoration. But that explanation has a problem. Decoration doesn't end up in your bloodstream. You can call a faraway land God's land all you like. You cannot metabolize a metaphor. And somewhere in the tissue of these mummies were molecules that only one continent on Earth could have produced. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A chemical fact sealed inside a body waiting 3,000 years for a machine that could read it. So let's do what investigators do. Let's lay out the clues. There are 3 of them, and each one looks like a coincidence until you put it next to the others. The first clue is the most famous mummy in the world. In September 1976, the body of Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, the pharaoh who ruled for 67 years and whose face still stares out of half the monuments in Egypt, was flown to Paris. He was deteriorating, infested with fungus, and France had the technology to save him. He was received at the airport with the honors of a visiting head of state. Then, he was taken to the Museum of Mankind and quietly taken apart by scientists. One of them was Dr. Michelle Lescott, a botanist from the Natural History Museum in Paris. Her job was to study the plant material woven into the pharaoh's bandages and packed into his body. Under the microscope, she found leaf fragments. She identified the plant. It was tobacco nicotiana. She thought she had made a mistake, so she did it again and again. Each time, the same answer. A New World plant embedded in a body that had been sealed in an Egyptian tomb 32 centuries earlier. The obvious objection came instantly. Contamination. Maybe a pipe-smoking 19th century archaeologist had dropped a flake of tobacco onto the mummy. The chief curator in Cairo, himself a pipe smoker, suggested exactly that. Lescott's answer was forensic. She went back to the mummy and extracted fresh samples, not from the surface, but from deep inside the abdominal cavity, from material that had been packed into the body during mummification and sealed there ever since. She had the entire extraction photographed as she worked, so no one could claim a stray flake had floated in. The new, sealed, internal samples were tested. Tobacco again. That is the first clue. The second comes from inside Henut Taui herself, and from the bodies that lay around her in Munich. When Balabanova and her colleagues went deeper than the hair, they found the drugs distributed through the body in a pattern. This matters more than it sounds. Surface contamination sits on the surface. It clings to the outer wrappings, the exposed skin. It does not work its way evenly into bone and deep tissue. But in these mummies, the substances were found in the hair, the skin, the muscle, and the bone. And here's where it gets strange. In a later, even more rigorous study of an Egyptian mummy, scientists led by researchers including Franz Parsche and Albert Nerlich didn't just find the drugs. They mapped where they concentrated. Cannabis compounds, THC, peaked in the lungs, as if it had been inhaled. Nicotine and cocaine peaked in the stomach, the intestines, the liver, as if they had been swallowed. Think about what that means. The chemicals weren't just present. They were distributed exactly the way they would be in a living body that had consumed them. Smoked one, eaten the others, and then been preserved. The pattern wasn't random. It told a story about behavior, about a person who used these substances while alive and whose organs recorded it. They weren't contaminated. They were documented. The body itself was the record. And there's a final detail in this clue that is hard to explain away. Alongside the nicotine, the tests found codeine, the specific compound your liver produces when it breaks nicotine down. Cotinine doesn't fall out of the sky. It doesn't drift off an archaeologist's pipe. Cotinine means a living body processed nicotine, internally, biologically, before death. The third clue is the one that turns a curiosity into a pattern. Balabanova did not stop with the Munich mummies. Over the following years, she tested more than 100 ancient bodies and skeletons, not only from Egypt, but from Sudan, from China, from Europe. Across that enormous sample, roughly a third tested positive for nicotine, and a smaller but real number for cocaine. Sit with that for a moment. This was no longer one anomalous priestess in one Bavarian museum. It was a signal appearing again and again in graves separated by thousands of miles and, in some cases, by thousands of years. Bodies from the Nile, bodies from Nubia in what is now Sudan, bodies from China. The same molecules surfacing in populations that, as far as we know, never met. A single fluke can be a contaminated sample. A scatter this wide starts to look like something else. It starts to look like a pattern, and patterns have causes. Now, the nicotine on its own has possible explanations, and we will get to them honestly, because the skeptics have a point worth hearing. But the cocaine is the splinter that won't come out. There is no old world plant that produces cocaine. None. The coca shrub is found in the Andes and nowhere else in the ancient world. You cannot brew it from an Egyptian herb. You cannot fake it with a Mediterranean flower. If cocaine is genuinely inside these bodies, there is exactly one source for it on the entire planet, and it sits on the far side of an ocean nobody was supposed to have crossed. 3 clues. Tobacco sealed inside a pharaoh. Drugs distributed and metabolized through a priestess as if she'd used them in life. And a continent-wide scatter of impossible chemistry, one piece of which has no old-world explanation at all. Then, modern science found something that changed everything, or at least made the easy answers harder: the dating. The Munich mummy at the center of the most careful follow-up study was carbon dated to roughly 950 BC. This was not a modern body dressed up. The provenance, the wrappings, the mummification style, the radiocarbon, all of it pointed to a genuine ancient Egyptian who died around 3,000 years ago. The tools that confirmed her age were the same kind of tools that found the drugs: gas chromatography paired with mass spectrometry, the analytical equivalent of a fingerprint, capable of identifying a single compound out of a complex mess of decayed tissue. And the more places that looked, the more often the answer came back the same: a new world signal in an old world grave. So what happened to all of this? If the evidence is this strong, why isn't it in the textbooks? This is where the story takes on the shape that anyone who has chased a buried discovery will recognize. The report was published, and then it was largely ignored. Not refuted, not disproven. Ignored. The kind of silence that is louder than an argument. Balabanova, a serious forensic scientist with a spotless professional record, found herself treated as an embarrassment. Attempts to reproduce her work were uneven. Some labs found nicotine, some found nothing. And that messiness was used not as a reason to investigate further, but as a reason to close the file. The cocaine, the part with no innocent explanation, was the part everyone seemed most eager to stop discussing. The official position settled into something like this. The mummies were probably contaminated. The results were probably flawed. The matter was probably closed. Three probablys stacked on top of one another and called a conclusion. But the samples that mattered most had been taken from sealed internal cavities. The metabolite that mattered most, cotinine, could only form inside a living body. And the drug that mattered most, cocaine, had no local origin to be contaminated by. The explanation leaves gaps. And the people who pointed at the gaps were quietly shown the door. Consider what happened to the woman at the center of it. Svetla Balabanova had built a career on being right when it mattered, on giving testimony precise enough to stand up in court, on detecting substances that other people swore weren't there. The whole value of a forensic toxicologist is that she does not see things that aren't real. And yet, the moment her machines found something the textbooks forbade, the same precision that made her trustworthy in a courtroom was suddenly called incompetence in a museum. She said, in interviews years later, that she had never expected the result either, that she had assumed there was a mistake, run it again, sent it out blind, and only published when she could not make it go away. The reward for that caution was to spend the rest of her career defending herself against the accusation that she had imagined the impossible. The data didn't fade. The discussion of it did. The file wasn't closed because it was answered. It was closed because it was inconvenient. Now, let's slow down, because this is the moment where a responsible investigation has to stop running and turn around to face the strongest argument against it. And there is a strong argument. In 2001, two researchers, Paul Buckland and Eva Panagiotokopoulou, published a careful takedown in the journal Antiquity. Their focus was the tobacco beetle. Here is their case, and it is a good one. In the 19th century, when these mummies were dug up and shipped to Europe, museums had a pest problem. Insects ate ancient remains. And one of the common insecticides of the era was tobacco. Powdered, infused, used to fumigate collections. The tobacco beetle, Lacioderma sericorn, was found associated with Ramesses' mummy. So perhaps the tobacco wasn't ancient at all. Perhaps it was a Victorian preservative soaked into bodies 150 years ago, not 3,000. And nicotine has another loophole. A handful of old world plants, certain nightshades, certain herbs the Egyptians genuinely did use, contain small amounts of nicotine naturally. So a nicotine signal by itself is not proof of tobacco. So does this prove the most extreme version of the story? Fleets of Egyptian ships running coca across the Atlantic. A forgotten transoceanic empire? Probably not. The skeptics have landed real blows. The tobacco could, in part, be contamination. The nicotine could, in part, be local. But that doesn't make the discovery ordinary. Because even after you grant the skeptics everything they've fairly earned, two things are left standing on the table, and nobody has knocked them off. The first is cocaine. There is no 19th century cocaine insecticide soaking these bodies. There is no old world coca plant. Contamination requires a contaminant. And for cocaine in 1000 BC, there simply isn't one available in Africa or Europe. You can explain the tobacco, you cannot, with the same ease, explain the cocaine. The second is the pattern inside the body, the metabolite cotinine, the organ-by-organ distribution that mirrors living consumption. A beetle in the bandages doesn't put cotinine in the liver. A Victorian fumigant doesn't sort itself into lungs versus intestines the way a living metabolism does. So the grounded version of this story is not nothing happened. The grounded version is this. Strip away the hype, and you are still left with at least one chemical compound in genuinely ancient Egyptian bodies that has no business existing in the old world. and a body chemistry that looks less like contamination and more like life. That is not a closed case. That is a crack in the wall. So let's stand at the crack and look through it and ask what we'd be looking at if even the modest version is true. If a single coca molecule genuinely crossed from South America to North Africa 3,000 years ago, then something we are told was impossible happened. It does not require an empire. It does not require fleets. It might require only one improbable voyage. A raft caught in a current, a trade route stitched together over centuries through hands we've never identified. A single chain of contact long enough for a leaf, or a habit, or a cargo, to travel from the Andes to the Nile. We know the currents could carry a vessel across. We know ancient peoples built ocean-capable craft. We know the Egyptians wrote again and again of a distant god's land that supplied them with things their own world could not. We assumed that was poetry. What if they weren't being poetic? What if they were keeping an inventory? If even the smallest version of this is real, then the map of the ancient world is wrong. Not dramatically rewritten, but wrong in a way that matters, because it would mean the oceans were not the walls we imagined. It would mean that somewhere between the Andes and Thebes, there was a thread of contact that left no surviving ships, no surviving logs, no surviving names. A whole chapter of human movement that we can detect only as a chemical ghost in the tissue of the dead. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter, not a footnote. A chapter about who reached whom and when, and how far ordinary people and their cargoes traveled across a world we've been told they could not cross. Which leaves one question that no one has answered. If the coca reached her, if it really is in there, then someone carried it across an ocean or hand to hand around the world through people and places we have no record of at all. Who were they? And why has every trace of them vanished, except for what they left inside a dead woman's hair? She is still there. Right now, as you watch this, Henut Taui lies in her glass case in Munich, exactly where she has lain for over 100 years. The label still gives her name and her century. The crowds still drift past her on their way to the gold. And inside her, locked in tissue that has outlasted 30 centuries of human argument, the molecules are still there too. Still impossible, still unexplained, still waiting for someone with the nerve to ask the question that the textbooks refuse to print. The case is sealed. The body is silent. And the answer is still inside her. If this rattled something loose in you, watch the next investigation on screen now. Another body, another sealed room, another piece of the past that doesn't fit the story we were handed. Pull the thread with me. It goes deeper than they want you to know.